I started all this about 10 years ago at Ardross Primary School here in Perth, and it's grown over the period of time, particularly in the last few years. So Trees4Change is really about taking city kids out to the country and planting a whole lot of seedlings in a short period of time. And you can see in the opening photograph there's a group of students planting in a paddock. This is about 15 kilometres west of York in the Western Wheat Belt in WA. So why this program? Why did we get started on this? Well, really, over a period of time, we wanted to give young people the hope and confidence to tackle large environmental problems. And we felt that by getting them out into the country and doing some tree planting, we could show them that they could do a lot in a short period of time. If they can do it with tree planting, they can do it with other things. And of course, we're also about creating the next generation of land carers. The way we run these programs is we're funded externally. It's largely through land care grants. Here in the West, it's the Natural Resource Management Office, which is part of the Department of Agriculture, have provided the majority of our funding. But I must mention the Rotary Club of Melville, who've been very supportive of us too, and helped us buy the tree planters that we used. And you can see that little fellow in the middle of the picture is holding a tree planter. He's also got a bucket around his shoulder. The bucket is an old 20-litre container that we've cleaned and cut the top off to use for carrying seedlings in. And my view is that as long as the kids are taller than the equipment that they're using, then we're happy to take them tree planting. I was doing a demonstration with this fellow down at Yarloop, and he was a very helpful little man in putting the project, me doing the demonstration and doing the tree planting down there. Let me give you a snapshot of some of the activities that we've been undertaking this year. This is down at Mile Up is about 130 kilometres south of Perth, and that's the Indian Ocean you can see there in the background. It's about 40 kilometres north of Bunbury, and there's some very large sand dunes which are very open to the sea along there. And in conjunction with the Shire of Harvey, we've started revegetating those areas. And you can see the Shire of Harvey has already put some branches, some brushwood on the sand dune, and we're planting in amongst it. There was 4 schools involved in this project, about 200 students in total, and they planted 12,500 seedlings on about 1.5 hectares of that sand dune. And the particular group that we've got there was from a Perth primary school who'd come down for the day, and there were 89 Year 6 students in that group, and they planted 6,500 seedlings in the time that they were there, and that was an absolutely fabulous outcome. They did really well. Whenever I'm doing these projects, I like to work in conjunction with the local community groups, wherever they are, and this is the Mile Up Community Association, and they were a fabulous group of people to work with. They really were. That's Marty, who's a member of the association there, watering the seedlings, and Marty and 3 or 4 of his contemporaries helped me with getting the seedlings down to the beach and then keeping the seedlings up to the kids. You can see we've got the seedlings in a tennis court there, and we had to do that because there's lots of kangaroos that hop in and eat the grass around the outside at night, and we didn't want the kangaroos eating our seedlings before we got them planted. This is another project. This is at Nunorcia. It's about 130 kilometres north of Perth. It's a Benedictine community. I think there's only about 8 monks that live there these days. But this is a school group from a Perth high school, a bushranger group. As it happens, these kids are all special needs kids, but they came up and spent 3 days staying at Nunorcia in the accommodation, and on one of the days I took them tree planting. So that's quite a different area to planting along the coast. This is Bull Creek, and this is a group of primary school kids planting along the floodplain around Bull Creek, and despite the fact that that looks like it's very rural, Bull Creek is actually 10 kilometres south of the Perth CBD, and it's surrounded by suburbia. So this is a really nice little urban land care project which I did in conjunction with the South East Regional Centre for Urban Land Care, or CIRCLE. So wherever possible, I try and work in conjunction with other people who are doing similar sorts of projects and get the kids involved. They're planting sedges in this area to try and help stabilise the floodplain along the edge of Bull Creek. Back to the more rural sort of site, and I've included this particular photo for everybody on the eastern side of the continent who's in drought conditions at the moment. I can promise you it will rain again. This was a very wet site that we had back in early August, about 28 kilometres north of Williams, and this is fairly typical of some of the sorts of farmer sites that we get. It's a gully down the middle of a paddock, and it can get very wet. Sometimes they're saline, and this is a group of bushranger cadets planting up the gully there. And the other thing that's worth saying about this site is this is the third occasion that it's been planted. On the first occasion, the farmer told me he had a series of frosts immediately after the site was planted, and that killed most of the seedlings. The second occasion, when things went wrong for him, there was a car accident on the Albany Highway, which is only about 200 metres from the site, and it was in the dry time of year, and it started a fire, and it burnt all the seedlings that he planted there. So we hope that we're a lot luckier for him this time, that all the seedlings that we've planted in that site this year grow and survive. This is another interesting site. This is Clover Brook Farm, which is near Wandering. In the background, you can see a line of trees. It's 14 Mile Brook, which rises about 50 kilometres east of this site. So when there is a lot of rain, the Clover 14 Mile Brook really flows, and it can overflow and up the banks onto this floodplain. So the farmer's idea is to fence it off and to try and stabilise the banks and the floodplain by planting seedlings along there. But the other thing that's important that this photo shows is you can see the ute with the trailer behind it, and keeping the seedlings up to the students is really important. The farmer's the chap in the red cap who's just on the other side of the fence, and he's handing seedlings over to some runners who are taking them out to the students so the students can keep planting. And that's how we do large numbers of seedlings in a fairly short period of time. This is another site, Pumphrey's Bridge near Wandering, and I've included this one because it's year fours who drove out to the country one day to go planting. So these are 9-10-year-olds, and they find it a little bit hard to handle the equipment. So mostly with a group like that, we'll get the adults to handle the tree planters, and the kids will keep the seedlings up to them. But it just shows that this sort of project is fabulous. You can get all ages involved, and Peter and Paula Sampson, this is the one that you helped with. I don't think it was the day that you were there, it was the day before, but thank you for your input into that one too. That was a fabulous effort for those kids. Wherever possible, we try and include with a day planting some understanding of the Indigenous culture and history for the area. The Noongar group is the group for the Southwest Land Division here in WA, and so we call it a Noongar experience. And here we have Greg Nannup, who's talking about the importance of grass trees in Noongar culture. And that's a group of kids from a school in Fremantle. So that's the sort of thing we do, and you're very welcome to ask, well, does all this work? Well, let me take you to Kim Hughes' site in West Pingelly and show you what's happened over the last couple of years. This is back in August 2016, where we had a group of high school students from Applecross Senior High School. They were year 9s planting in the site, and there were 40 kids came out that day, and they planted 5,000 seedlings on that site. So it's August 2016. By May 2017, the site looked like that, and you can see my little clipboard there in the middle row. By the end of that year, the weeds had got up a bit, and my clipboard's there again. I was a little bit concerned about how well the seedlings were going to survive in amongst all those weeds, but I needn't have worried too much, because by the end of April this year, that's what the site looked like. And you can see those trees had grown really well. They're now taller than me, and the shrubs, which were a bit lost in the weeds, seem to have overcome that. So yes, it does work. It does a fabulous job. And let me show you another site. This is east of Pingelly, and this is on a salt scald. There was absolutely nothing growing here. It was just bare ground. And about 12 months afterwards, the salt bush that we'd planted there was starting to do really well. And that's my then 22-year-old daughter who's standing next to them to give them some sense of scale. So yes, what we do works. And it's a great feeling to be able to go back and see sites like that Saltzgold and see how well the seedlings have done. So that really leads us to, well, what inspired all the schools to get involved in this? And really the catalyst for this program taking off was the Low Carbon Schools pilot program, which was run by Simply Carbon. It was for the years 2016 and 2017 that the pilot program ran, and there were 15 schools here in Perth involved in that. And we calculated for the baseline year, which was 2015, that those 15 schools had produced about 3,800 tonnes of CO2 equivalent from their utilities usage, so water, electricity and gas in this case. And Vanessa, who runs Low Carbon Schools, said to me, Bruce, can we plant enough seedlings to offset that 3,800 tonnes? And without really knowing whether we could or how many we'd need, I said, oh yes, Vanessa, we can do that. So I went off and did a little bit of research and did some calculations, and I worked out that we needed to plant about 40,000 seedlings in a biodiverse planting in order to offset those emissions. Now, I hasten to add, this is a notional offset. We just wanted the kids to have the experience of being able to plant the seedlings. We weren't going to record it and keep those sites in perpetuity, but we trusted that the farmers and the other land managers that we worked with would do that. So the other thing that's worth mentioning is that it's only large trees that you can use to offset carbon emissions. When I talk about a biodiverse planting, I'm talking about 2/3 of the seedlings being planted as shrubs and understory and only 1/3 trees. What we were aiming for was in 30 to 40 years' time to have about 8,000 large trees, which look like the ones in this photograph. So 380mm diameter trunk and probably about 15 metres tall, and they should sequester about 125 kilograms of carbon each. In order to get those 8,000 live trees in 3 decades' time, we'd be planting about 14,000 now, and that would be the rate of about, we plant at 670 to the hectare, large trees, and we'd expect about 400 of them to be alive per hectare in 3 or 4 decades' time. Now, Low Carbon Schools was successful here in Perth, so Vanessa, who runs it, decided to relaunch it as Climate Clever, and this has become a lot more sophisticated, and this is a really fabulous program. So the first thing that the kids do, and this is a kid organised activity, is that they work out what the carbon footprint is for the school. Now, they might need a bit of help from the adults to do this, but the data comes from the school's utilities bills, so water, electricity, gas, and waste in this case. So once they've measured the carbon footprint, they then do an audit of the school buildings using an audit tool, and all this is done online. And they can record where all the electricity points are in each building and where all the other facilities, the gas outlets are, and so on. And eventually they develop a climate action plan, and that's really where we fit in to do the offsetting. But there's lots of work that most schools can do in the school to start off with to reduce their electricity and other utilities usage. So I really encourage people, if this sounds a bit interesting, go and have a look at the climateclever.org website. Vanessa is actually in Sydney, and she's launching Climate Clever in Sydney on Tuesday of next week. So have a look. You might, if you're in Sydney, you might even get to go along and find out a bit more about Climate Clever. But we come in because we can plant the seedlings once the schools have organised, have worked out how many tonnes of CO2 they're emitting. We can then go out and take the school kids out to plant those seedlings on a site and offset the emissions. One of the other things I try and do with taking kids out into the country to plant is to try and add value to what they do. And this is at a very practical level. This is a drone photograph of the site at Mylup, and you can see some little white and green guards across the tree guards across the site there. This is a STEM activity, science, technology, engineering and maths, and what we're trying to do is to get the kids to think about simple things they can do to improve what we're doing. is what that site looks like from the ground. Now, closest to you are some cardboard tree guards. Then there is a gap, which is our nil plot. There's plants through there, but there's no guards around them. And then the green ones further back are corflute guards. Corflute is basically plastic that's made in the shape of cardboard. So it's a different system of guards. What I was trying to do here was to say, are we better off just planting more seedlings at 55 cents each on this site, or is it worth putting on a 50-cent cardboard guard? So each seedling now costs us $1.05, or would we be better off to go to a corflute so that each seedling costs us $2 to get established? And I want the kids to be able to come back and count the survival rates and then do some calculations using those dollar amounts to work out what's the best way to handle a really open, a really exposed site like this one. This is another site. This is in the southern suburbs of Perth, a place called Wandy, where there's a lot of 2-hectare blocks, and in the middle of it there's a Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions regional park. It's part of Jandakot Regional Park, but the block is called Anketel North. Of the 280 hectares in the park, there's probably about 60 hectares of it that's been cleared and used for farming, and some of it looks like this degraded bushland, Banksia woodland that you can see there. Looking in the other direction, it looks like this. So it's grey sand, it's Bassendean sand, and we looked at it and thought, well, what should we be doing in order to do some management practices to make this site successful? And I wondered whether it had been compacted or not, and whether it was worth trying to rip this site with a ripper behind the tractor. And what led me to think that was this particular site, which is over at Woodman Point on very similar sand. And you can see, looking in the middle of that site, the seedlings are nowhere near as well grown as those on either side. And I think that's an old track where vehicles have been going through it and where compaction has slowed down the growth rate of the seedlings. So despite the fact that it's sand, sand can still get compacted. So this is what we decided to do. We got a little tractor out and we put a ripper on the back, and he went up and down across part of the site at Anketel North to break the ground up for us. And then we planted a trial with the kids. So the treatments we have here are a nil treatment. Then we have a treatment where there is ripping only. Then I decided it'd be a good idea if we put wetter soil on some of this to see if that improved the survival rate of the seedlings. So we have another plot which is wetter soil only, and then we have a final plot which is wetter soil and ripping. So the idea here is that the kids will come back and count the survival rate of the seedlings and see if those treatments make any impact. One of the important things we discovered about the ripping without really thinking about it was that kids of this size, and these are year 6s, were finding it quite hard to push the tree planters into the sand that hadn't been ripped. So just by ripping, it will reduce the number of misplants and it will speed up the rate of planting. So we felt that it was a good idea to actually do this, whether or not we get an improvement in survival rate. It's not a hugely expensive activity to do. In these coastal plain plantings, we're planting 10,000 seedlings per hectare, so $1,000 for ripping it, it's only adding another 10 cents a seedling on there, and I feel it's reasonably assured that we'll get the return on that money. So that's another trial we've done with the kids. And here's the third one. On the coastal plain, the conventional wisdom is that you buy a $1.50 forestry tube, a 200cc tube, and the seedling is grown in that. Now out in the wheat belt, I buy 50-cent seedlings that are grown in either 50 or 85cc cell trays. And I thought, why are we using these really expensive seedlings on the coastal plain where maybe we can use the cheaper ones of exactly the same species? So we set out to test this out with the city of Coburn, and this is a typical city of Coburn site. They've used a bobcat to scalp the site. The topsoil with all the weed seeds has been taken off and spread around elsewhere. And as typical for the city of Coburn, they have used a little auger to drill holes to put the seedlings in. And you can see that's just being finished off in that photo. Here's the kids planting the seedlings on that site. So they're planting rows of the same species grown either in 200cc forestry tubes or 85cc cell trays. And that's what the site looked like when it was finished. And you can see the row with number 11. There's some Banksias growing up there. Those particular ones were in the 85cc cells. And row number 9 is the Banksias grown in the 200cc forestry tubes. So we'll get the kids back in there to actually count those sites and see what the survival rate is there. And on that particular site, that is the density that the city of Coburn would normally plant at. That's 20,000 seedlings per hectare. And that's what it looks like when you set it out in rows. I might add they would not normally plant it in rows, but we've done it so that it's easy for the kids to be able to count the seedlings and see what the survival rate is. So just to sum up, what we're trying to do is to engage the kids in the discussion here. We use tree guards, but are they really necessary? And if so, what type of guards? And does ripping improve the seedling health and survival rate? And thirdly, are we better off using $1.50 seedlings, or could we get just the same survival rate with a 50-cent seedling? And in the background of this, what I'm trying to do is to understand the management practices that are suitable for particular sites. And as I'm largely dependent on grant funding for these projects, how can I give grants the biggest bang for their dollar? Now, the other thing, of course, is we're very interested in engaging youth in these projects. So if you want to engage them, let's go somewhere interesting and do something interesting as well as tree planting. So here we are at Dryandra Woodland, and this is actually my family because I couldn't find a photograph of kids down at Dryandra Woodland where I knew I had photo permission for it. So this is taken in December, and it's usually a lot colder than standing around in shorts and t-shirts when we're planting down there in July, August, but it illustrates the point. So we were just put out a trap line there. It's my 2 daughters standing closest to the camera there. And the idea is the trap line goes out late one afternoon. They're cage traps. That's John, who's one of the DBCA employees, has just put the trap line, the cage trap down. And then we come back the next morning and have a look and see what we've caught. Now, Dryandra Woodland, where we're putting these traps, has been baited for foxes and cats for many years now. And so there are populations of native marsupials like woylies and of course possums in the area, and there are the odd chidditch and other little native animals that grow there. So we're quite keen to see what's happening. And it's a fabulous experience for the school kids to put out a trap line in the afternoon and go back the next morning. The kids don't get to handle the animals. There's always a trained handler who handles them, but he shows them how to get them out of the trap, how to weigh them, how to measure them, to tell whether they're male or female, whether they're pregnant or not, and then how to let them go so that they can go back into the wild. Kids love doing that. It's a really good experience for them. So this is another value-adding thing that we're trying to do to engage the kids in getting out into the country. Here's another one. This is Barnamaya Animal Sanctuary, which is also at Dryandra. There are half a dozen native marsupials that are endangered living in there. That's a picture of a bilby. This is another thing that the kids love going along and doing, is going at night and seeing these nocturnal animals. They get about 10% of their food from being fed. Like you can see that bilby's having some dinner there, but it's a fantastic activity, and the kids actually get to see what a real bilby looks like. Another thing, in taking kids onto farms, this is the first time they've ever been on a farm, so we give them the opportunity to hold a lamb or to go and touch some sheep, and most of the kids think that's fantastic. Where possible, we work in some field work with an ecologist. This is Brett Beecham from Narrogin, from DBCA office in Narrogin, and he's explaining to the kids about how some of the native animals have adapted to living in the eucalypt woodland that you can see in the background of the photograph there. Where possible, we try and link things in with the curriculum as much as possible. Salinity is an issue in the wheat belt, particularly for year 9s. This is a group of boys who are looking at the salinity in the creek water that you can see there. This is on UWA's farm near Pingelly, and in fact where they're measuring the salinity there, it's virtually fresh, and they've got electrical conductivity meters. We walk them down that creek about 1 kilometre, and by the time they get to the boundary, the water is already 20% as salty as seawater. So it gives the kids a real feel for this is a problem that's occurring. Salinity is an issue for us, and how we're going to deal with it. And of course, some of the tree planting that they do is aimed at offsetting the impact of salinity. This is Forest Crescent Primary School down at Woodman Point doing a planting, and I've included this photograph because the man on the right is Andy Holmes, who's the principal of Forest Crescent. And to make these projects work, you really need the cooperation of people like the principal. And he loves it. He's really on board with doing this kind of work, of getting his kids out into the open and doing some planting. It benefits the kids in his mind, and that's just fabulous. It's exactly what I'm there for, so the kids can have a good time and they can do something positive. This is in a public place. They can bring their families back there and go and have a look at where their seedlings have been planted. Now, the other side of this is Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions don't have the funding to do the planting. So if I can find the funding from an external source and I can bring the labour force along with the seedlings, then they're very happy to chip in and help. So it's a real win-win for them too. And as you can see, they've got their ute there. They've got a trailer in the back, which has got a mixture of wetting agent and also sea salt, which they water the seedlings in with. That particular planting was done at the end of May, and there hadn't been very much rain, so that's why we water them in. But really the point of this is it works for everybody. It works for the land manager and it works for the schools and the kids, and that collaboration is really important. And that's the Woodman Point site for the air. You can see all the little cardboard gardens there. We're very pleased with the outcome of that. So this is where we started on all of this project. This is back at Ardross Primary School. That's what the front of the school looked like in 2008. And you can see on the right-hand side of the photograph there, there's a lemon-scented gum, a large white-trunked eucalypt, spectacular trees planted back in the early 1960s when the school was new. But unfortunately, one of the things that they do is to stop anything from growing underneath them. And you can see the bare sand there. When I say growing anything from growing, it certainly stops lawn from growing underneath them. Now that part of the school was being watered as if it was an oval. So it was getting the equivalent of 25 millimetres of rain every week from the irrigation system around the school. And when the then new deputy principal, Kath Bishop, turned up, she wanted to do something about changing these kinds of things that were happening at the school. So we decided we'd try and convert this into a native garden. And we calculated we could save 2 million litres of bore water a year just by not watering this 2,000 square metres in front of the school as if it was an oval. So that's what it looked like in 2008. That's the same thing today. So you can see we got rid of all the lawn. We put in some paths and we planted some native seedlings, some native species in the area. Now, we weren't trying to recreate the native bush. We were trying to make a point about growing species from lower rainfall areas as a way of offsetting the impact of climate change. And so we've got species from the wheat belt. Some of them are rare species. Some of them are quite unusual. Some are species that have a possible agricultural benefit. But there's a whole range of different things that are in that site. This is what the journey was on the way. This is back in 2012. So you can see the front of the school there again. The lawn's all gone. We sprayed it with glyphosate and then we got a rotary hoe in and dug it all up so that we broke up the thatch from the lawn. Then down went the subsurface retic. The paths went in and then we put some mulch on top of that, and the kids dug holes through the mulch and planted the seedlings. So, and seedlings that you can see closest to the camera there were planted in 2012. The ones in the middle of the picture were planted in 2011. 15 months later, that's what that same site looked like. And if we take a step on from that, that's that same path as it looks today. And really the key to all this is the kids. We grew 95% of the seedlings that we planted there in a little nursery we've got at the school, and they're the ones who planted it all. They're our most important natural resource. This is what planting looks like. This is a moment of peace before the kids come. You can see all the equipment there, the tree planters on the right, the seedlings across the middle, and the buckets on the left. In the background, we've got a portable toilet because this is down at Ankertil North and there's no facilities close around there at all. And that was very kindly donated to us by Kennard's Hire, who were able to allow us to have the toilet, which makes a huge difference to be able to run these programs. Here's the kids. They've turned up, and this is where the action starts. And this was the action for the last few years. In 2017, we had 700 students involved from 14 schools, and we planted over 50,000 seedlings. This year, we've had about 1,200 students from 23 schools involved, and we've planted over 80,000 seedlings. And our goal for next year is to have 3,000 students from 50 schools involved, and we'll plant 150,000 seedlings. I say we will. It all depends on whether we can get the funding, because our funding from our grant source doesn't look like it's going to be anywhere near what we're going to need to do that for this coming year. So these programs are fabulous, but they're not funded from within the Education Department, and we need to find external funding to do it. So really, Rod, that's my story. That's what Trees4Change has been about for the last few years. And it's a very scalable activity. We can do it in other parts of Australia. It really all depends on being able to find the money and then the personnel to be able to carry it out. But it's very exciting. It's a real win for the land managers, and it's a win for the school kids.
That's great, Bruce. Thank you for sharing that with you. And it's very inspiring to see what one person with a few supports can do and achieve by plugging into existing, just a few small grants and plugging into a program in the schools. It's just fantastic. And what I love about it is the lots of practical hands-on learning there, but also obviously learning that they take back into the classroom in terms of working out some of those maths problems that you set them. But the thing that I love most about it is that it must be significantly raising their awareness of the environment generally, but also of climate change and of ways of addressing climate change through tree growing and restoring habitat. But I was also thinking when I was talking about this the other day, that it must be having a significant effect on some of the staff in the schools as well, that they see that they are part of a program that is very climate positive and carbon positive. And so thank you very much for that. That's brilliant.
You're very welcome, Rod. And yes, the staff seem to love it. I've had several new schools out this year, and they're all very keen to come back again next year. So as long as we can find the funding, we're on.
And it's also great that this is expanding to the east in terms of the Climate Clever program. Climate Clever School seems to be ready to be exported to the east, so that's great. And so we've got time for a couple of questions from anyone who'd like to clarify anything that Bruce has shared with us, or ask any further questions.
Oh, this is Viv from Canberra.
Hello, Viv.
I was just wondering, where does your funding come from? Is it federal or state?
At this stage, it's all state. The WA government has a program called the State Natural Resource Management Program, and we apply for land care grants from there. It's all land care work. We had ideas about applying for National Land Care Program funding earlier in the year, but there was some confusion about small grants from NLP2 as to whether we could apply for it as through the state school. Most of the schools I deal with are actually state schools. There's only one or two private schools involved, and we couldn't apply because they were government bodies, and I don't know whether the rules have been changed, but we apply for the funding through schools. We couldn't access the NLP funding, but we're hoping to alter that.
Bruce,
Yeah,
could you stop the screen share for a minute so we can all see? We can
Yeah,
see what,
certainly.
I was just going to say to you that, like here in the ACT, I like bits of your program, and we've got our sustainable schools, and we do schools work on doing energy audits, waste audits, that sort of thing. But your end bit, once they've worked through that and looked at, where they can save energy and all this sort of thing, adding in the planting of the trees as an offset is something that I haven't actually seen done here. I'll have to ask some people about in the sustainable schools, whether they do that. But the whole process of what you're describing, I think, is really, I did a similar thing at my child's school in terms of through the P&C, we actually got an environmental grant and did a grassy woodlands garden out the front, but it was a whole community thing because we got help from Greening Australia, but we also got the local scouts involved, and teachers would bring out classes because it was just out the front of the school, and it's a really good model for getting kids and families, because we had a lot of, because it was done through the P&C, we had a lot of family involvement, and also families that wouldn't normally come to a P&C meeting, like refugee families and things like that, which felt they could help the school by bringing their kids digging holes and planting plants, or helping with the watering afterwards. So, I think that what you're doing, how does it fit in with what Greening Australia's doing? Because here in the ACT, they often provide plants when schools are looking at trying to do native gardens and things. They're obviously we often the go-to people for getting plants and stuff.
Viv, some of these detailed conversations, I think it would be really good for you to speak directly with Bruce. And I'd like to give other people a chance to ask questions. And I noticed that Peter had one lined up. So, Peter, could you go ahead?
Yeah, I was just interested in the advantages of the tree cover for the seedlings. What makes it more likely to survive with a tree cover on it?
Do you mean the guards that we're putting around them? Yeah, well, the conventional wisdom is that it protects them from the wind, particularly on those very sites where it's very windy. The other reason to have guards, of course, is rabbits. And the site down at Woodman Point, there are rabbits in the area, so you want to keep the rabbits away from the seedlings while they're small. But where you don't have a problem with rabbits and it's only wind, my question was why would you put the guard on there if the seedlings will survive anyway? And the only real way to test that out was to actually put the trial in.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Howard, do you have a question?
Yeah, sure, Bruce. It's great that the kids are getting environmentally conscious, and the teachers. Is there a sort of a conscious program to bring the parents into environmental activism and get them engaged, maybe in Citizens Climate Lobby or some other group? As a conscious program?
Well, it varies with the school, because I really leave it up to the school, but I always encourage the schools to bring the parents along. So we get up to 15 or 16 parents who come along with some schools. Other schools, and that's mostly primary schools. The high schools, there doesn't tend to be any parents. It's usually always staff that are involved. But the primary schools are really quite keen, and of course this can then flow across into other activities that the school may be involved in. It's interesting listening to Viv talking about the way things are happening in the ACT. I know that Greening Australia is very active in the ACT in the community. It's not as active in the community here in Perth. So there is perhaps more opportunity for somebody like me to be able to do this with schools. And it's not, I think it'd be fabulous if Greening Australia was more active here, but it's just, that's the way things are. So I would really encourage schools to be involved, and part of the Climate Clever initiative is ultimately to take the message from schools about reducing the carbon footprint and the energy costs back into the school community and back home. And that's a big part of where Vanessa wants to go with Climate Clever, is so that she has a whole community impact, not just in the school.
That's fabulous, Bruce. And I noticed you had your mobile number on the last slide you showed. Can you read it out for Viv so that she can contact you direct?
Okay, it's 0408 855 656.
Great, because I can see you have a good lots to talk about and share. I think that's wonderful that we're making that connection. So, Bruce, thank you very much for that. You're welcome to stay on with us while I just talk for a few more minutes about actions for the month.
Well, thanks, Rod. It's been a pleasure. I hope everybody's enjoyed it.
It's very inspiring. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, applause from around Australia. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. And there may even be some applause from other groups who you won't be able to see because they're watching this as a recording. But,
okay, thanks, Rod.
Yeah. Okay, so that's really, really wonderful to have all that information and to see that all of that working in such good quality photographs, and so and hopefully we can figure out ways of building on what you're doing there, Bruce. So moving on to the actions for September, I'm going to share my screen here because it's useful for people to see this. Now, this is those of you who want to see the well, I'll circulate this link to everyone who's on the screen, but those of you who are watching the recording, just note up the top left there, this is called Monthly Actions and Speaker September to figure out which of these actions might be useful for your group. So the first one is that it's not too late to come to the conference or to encourage a friend, particularly if you have a friend or family who lives in Canberra or in New South Wales and is reasonably close. And you can register now at that link that I've provided there, or you can just go to our website and select the conferences drop-down menu, and that'll take you to the registration process. Now, one of the things that we do at CCL is, and it's really important, is writing to our MPs and to a senator or two, to let them know what we're thinking about various things at any one time. And clearly, now that the neg is all but dead, and it looks like Prime Minister Morrison has killed it off this morning or last night, it's really important for us to be expressing support for a bipartisan policy so that we can get some investment certainty in energy. Now, this government only has another 7 or 8 months to run before the election, and it may or may not get re-elected, but it's still important that we work with all parties at this stage to keep encouraging them to be thinking about bipartisan policy. But always when we contact MPs, it makes sense for us to point out that our preferred policy is carbon fee and dividend, and it's much simpler and much more efficient than anything like the neg and all the other complicated sort of processes that they're having to design to deal with climate change. So that gives us an opportunity to promote our proposal. Now, last month we had a speaker on electric vehicles from Canberra, and he gave us a few pointers about ways in which we could contact our MPs to encourage them to support electric vehicles, and I've listed them there. There are 4 points. So if you're wanting to raise any of those, feel free to pick from there. And again, carbon fee and dividend is a very, very, very powerful way to incentivize electric vehicles, and makes it a lot easier for them to do it. To encourage you all to write letters to the editor in your local papers. And as I said earlier, before Bruce spoke, we've had some success, with quite a lot of success this month with letters to the editor, and it makes sense for us to keep doing that. And as usual, it's good to respond to articles and letters that we find in the newspapers already, and to build on that and suggest ways in which carbon fee and dividend can be a solution to that issue. But again, now that the government has abandoned all climate policy, we can actually sort of initiate some letters about carbon fee and dividend and about the climate generally, so that we don't have to wait for the newspaper or the letter writers to give us something to respond to. So that's something that you can think of as well. Just creating your own momentum in the newspaper. And then the final point here is that it's important to remind us to post field reports whenever we get a letter published, or we have a meeting with an MP, or we have a meeting with some other important organisation that is part of our process of creating the political will for a livable world. It's really important to log our field reports on the website, and I've provided the link there on this page. So just drawing attention to the top left of the page there, monthly actions and speakers, September 2018. You can find that by simply searching on your Google Drive. Okay, well, that's the call for today. I'll stop sharing so that we can all see each other again. Thanks again to